Picture a quiet stretch of countryside in northern France, long before the name Knights Templar carried any weight at all. No banners snapping in the wind, no fortified castles guarding treasure, no legends whispered in candlelit halls, just fields, forests, stone villages, and a world ordered by faith, duty, and violence in almost equal measure. Somewhere in this landscape, around the late 11th century, a man named Hugues de Payens was born, and with him began a story that would ripple across medieval Europe and beyond. Hugues did not enter history with a trumpet blast. He arrived into a rigid society where your future was largely decided before you could speak. Medieval France was organized like a ladder. At the top stood kings and great lords. Below them, layers of lesser nobles. Beneath those, farmers, laborers, and servants who worked the land. Hugues belonged to the lower rungs of the noble class. Not poor, but far from powerful. His family likely held modest lands near the village of Payens in the county of Champagne, a region known for fertile soil, strategic trade routes, and ambitious noble houses. This mattered because Champagne sat at a crossroads of ideas and movement. Merchants passed through. Clergy traveled between abbeys. Stories from distant lands arrived carried by pilgrims and veterans of war. Hugues grew up in a world that was not isolated, but increasingly connected, and increasingly restless. To understand Hugues, you need to understand the age that shaped him. Western Europe at the turn of the 12th century was both deeply religious and deeply violent. Faith was not a private matter. It ordered time, law, and identity. Church bells marked the day. Holy days shaped the year. The fear of judgment after death was ever present. At the same time, conflict was constant. Noble families feuded. Lords fought over borders. Raids and reprisals were part of life. For young men of noble birth, there were only a few acceptable paths. Some entered the church, others managed estates. Many trained for war. From an early age, Hugues would have learned how to ride, how to handle weapons, and how to obey a lord. These skills were not glamorous. They were practical. A noble who could not fight was a liability. Yet the church looked uneasily at this culture of constant bloodshed. Clergy preached peace. Councils declared periods when fighting was forbidden. And still, violence continued. The question hung in the air. Could a man serve both faith and battle without condemning his soul? This tension would shape Hugues more than any battlefield. In 1095, when Hugues was likely a young adult, a dramatic event shook Christendom. At the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II called for an armed pilgrimage to the east. Jerusalem, the most sacred city in Christian belief, was under Muslim control. Urban's message was clear. Those who took up arms for this cause would be defending the faith itself. This was not framed as conquest. It was framed as devotion, a journey of hardship and danger, undertaken for spiritual reward. Across Europe, men listened. Some were driven by belief, some by opportunity, some by a desire to escape debts or feuds. Hugues would have heard the call echo through Champagne, carried by sermons and rumors. The idea that fighting could become an act of faith, rather than a stain upon it, was revolutionary. The First Crusade unfolded with astonishing brutality and success. Against all expectation, Jerusalem fell in 1099. News of the victory spread like lightning. For many, it felt like divine approval made visible. For others, it raised new questions. What now? Jerusalem was in Christian hands, but the surrounding lands were dangerous. Pilgrims traveled thousands of miles to visit holy sites, only to face ambush, robbery, and death along the roads. The crusading armies had won cities, but they could not secure every path. This was the world Hugues stepped into as an adult. A world where faith demanded action, but action came at a cost. A world where noble warriors struggled to reconcile their lives with their beliefs. Little is recorded about Hugues' early personal life, and that silence is telling. He was not a great lord. He did not command armies. He appears in the margins of history, not its center. But absence of detail does not mean absence of importance. It means he lived the life of a typical lesser noble, bound by loyalty, expectation, and limited opportunity. What we do know is that Hugues had connections. He moved in circles where influential figures gathered. He was close enough to power to be heard, but not so close that he was burdened by wealth or legacy. This made him flexible, open to radical ideas. Around the early years of the 12th century, Hugues traveled to the Holy Land. Whether he arrived as part of a crusading force or as a pilgrim with arms is unclear. But once there, he saw the problem firsthand. The roads were dangerous. The faithful were vulnerable. The victory of the crusade felt incomplete. Here is where Hugues' story becomes extraordinary. Not because of sudden heroics, but because of a quiet decision. Rather than returning home with stories and relics, he stayed. Along with a small group of like-minded knights, he proposed something new. A brotherhood that would protect pilgrims. Men who would fight, but under religious discipline. Warriors who lived like monks. This idea cut across the grain of medieval society. Monks renounced violence. Knights embraced it. Combining the two seemed contradictory, even dangerous, and yet it answered a question many had been asking. How could a man of war serve God without abandoning his skills? Hugues was not the first to think this way, but he was among the first to act on it. His background mattered here. As a lesser noble, he was not defending a vast inheritance. As a man shaped by faith and conflict, he understood both worlds. He knew the discipline of the church and the realities of battle. The group was small, very small. Tradition speaks of 9 men. They took no grand titles. They did not claim glory. They approached the rulers of Jerusalem with a simple offer: protection, service, commitment. They were given quarters near the former Temple of Solomon, a location heavy with symbolism. From this association came their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a long name for a humble beginning. At first, they lived quietly. They owned little. They relied on support from others. They followed a simple rule: pray, train, guard the roads. But beneath this modest surface, something powerful was forming, a new model of knighthood, a new way to channel violence into purpose. And at its center stood Hugues de Payens, not as a conqueror, but as an organizer, a mediator, a man capable of turning an idea into an institution. His upbringing had prepared him for this moment. The discipline of noble life, the influence of the church, the chaos of crusading warfare. All of it converged here. As word of the brotherhood spread, reactions were mixed. Some saw devotion, others saw danger. A private group of armed men, bound by religious vows, answered to no single lord. That made rulers uneasy and clergy cautious. Hugues understood this. He knew that belief alone was not enough. To survive, the brotherhood needed recognition, legitimacy, a place within the structure of Christendom. That quest for approval would soon take him back to Europe, into the halls of power, where kings and churchmen debated the future of this strange new order. But that moment lies just ahead. For now, picture Hugues standing in Jerusalem, older than when he left France, shaped by travel and loss, preparing to take a vow that would strip away personal ambition in favor of collective purpose: poverty, chastity, obedience. With those words, spoken in a sacred space heavy with history, Hugues de Payens stepped fully into a role he could never have imagined as a boy in Champagne. And in that moment, the Knights Templar truly began. Imagine standing at the edge of something new, knowing it could either fade quietly into history or reshape the world around it. That was the position Hugues de Payens found himself in after the first vows were spoken in Jerusalem. A handful of men had pledged their lives to a radical idea, fighting in service of faith, bound by discipline rather than personal gain. It sounded noble, it sounded dangerous, and above all, it sounded fragile. The early years of the Brotherhood were anything but grand. There were no great fortresses yet, no famous banners, no wealth to speak of. The men lived simply, sharing food, space, and purpose. They escorted pilgrims along dusty roads, scanned hillsides for ambush, and returned at night to prayer and reflection. It was a life of routine and risk, held together by belief rather than reward. Hugues led not through command, but example. He was first among equals, guiding the group through consensus and shared commitment. His authority came from trust, not force. That mattered because the idea they were living was still untested. One bad decision could have ended everything. The rulers of Jerusalem watched closely. On one hand, the Brotherhood filled a desperate need. Pilgrims were arriving in greater numbers each year, inspired by stories of the holy city reclaimed. Protecting them was essential. On the other hand, a group of armed men operating outside traditional feudal control raised questions. Who did they answer to? What stopped them from becoming a private power? Hugues knew these doubts could not be ignored. If the Brotherhood was to survive, it needed more than good intentions. It needed official recognition from the church itself. That realization set the course for the next phase of his life. Sometime in the mid-1120s, Hugues left the Holy Land and returned to Europe. This was no simple journey. It meant crossing dangerous seas, navigating political tensions, and stepping back into a world he had left behind years earlier. But he did not return as a minor noble anymore. He returned as the representative of something unprecedented. His destination was the heart of Christian authority. Not Rome alone, but the network of abbeys, courts, and councils where ideas were debated and decisions made. One name loomed especially large in this world: Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was a towering figure of his age, a reformer, a mystic, a man whose words carried enormous weight with popes and kings alike. He believed deeply in discipline, humility, and devotion stripped of excess. When Hugues presented the idea of the Brotherhood to Bernard, he was speaking to someone uniquely prepared to understand it. The appeal was clear. Here were men rejecting wealth and comfort, living under strict rules, channeling violence into defense rather than personal ambition. Bernard saw in them a remedy to the chaos of knightly culture, a way to sanctify a role that had long troubled the church. With Bernard's support, doors opened. In 1129, a gathering known as the Council of Tours convened in France. Church leaders met to address various matters of reform and order. Among the issues brought forward was the fate of Hugues's brotherhood. Should it be recognized? Should it be regulated? Should it exist at all? Hugues stood before the council, not as a warrior, but as a petitioner. He explained the purpose of the order, its vows, its discipline, its service to pilgrims and holy sites. He did not promise conquest or glory, he promised restraint. The council approved the order. This moment cannot be overstated. With that decision, the brotherhood transformed from a local solution into an institution of Christendom. They were given an official rule of life. Influenced heavily by monastic traditions, they answered directly to the church, not to secular rulers. This independence was rare and powerful. For Hugues, it was a turning point. He was no longer merely organizing a small group of like-minded men. He was shaping an order that would soon stretch across continents. Support followed swiftly. Nobles donated land. Lords offered protection. Young men sought admission. The order spread through France, England, Iberia, and beyond. Houses were established to recruit, train, and support the mission in the East. Despite this growth, Hugues remained cautious. Expansion brought strength, but also risk. Discipline had to be maintained. Purpose had to remain clear. The order's identity depended on balance. Too much power, and it would attract enemies. Too little, and it would collapse. Daily life within the order reflected this careful equilibrium. Members rose early for prayer. They ate simply. They trained constantly. Their clothing was plain, marked only by a red cross that symbolized both sacrifice and service. This simplicity was deliberate. It reminded them who they were meant to be. Hollywood often imagines this period as one of instant dominance, but reality was slower and more uncertain. The order grew because it filled a need and inspired trust, not because it seized control. Hugues spent much of his time traveling, negotiating, and reinforcing the order's values. He was as much a diplomat as a warrior. His background prepared him well for this role. As a lesser noble, he understood both ambition and limitation. He could speak to kings without threatening them. He could reassure churchmen without challenging doctrine. He moved carefully through the corridors of power, always mindful that the order's survival depended on goodwill. Yet even as the brotherhood gained respect, whispers began to circulate. An order that answered only to the church. A network of fortified houses across Europe. A growing reputation for discipline and secrecy. For some, admiration slowly turned into unease. Hugues sensed this tension, even if he could not yet see where it would lead. He worked tirelessly to keep the order grounded in its founding mission. Protect pilgrims, defend sacred places, live humbly. By the time he returned to the Holy Land after the Council of Troyes, the order he led was no longer small or obscure. It was recognized, respected, and expanding. The mantle of leadership now carried immense weight. Hugues had become something rare in medieval history. The founder of a new institution that bridged faith and force. A man whose quiet resolve had unlocked the support of the most powerful voices of his age. But success carries its own challenges. Growth brings scrutiny. Influence invites rivalry. And ideas that reshape the world often create enemies as quickly as they create followers. As the Knights Templar settled into their new role, riding the thin line between devotion and power, the future held both promise and peril. And Hugues de Payens stood at the center of it all, unaware that the foundations he laid so carefully would one day become the very reason the order would be feared. Every story that begins quietly and grows powerful eventually reaches a moment of reckoning. For Hugues de Payens, that moment did not arrive with noise or spectacle, but with the weight of responsibility pressing heavier each year. By the time the Knights Templar were firmly established, the order no longer depended on hope alone. It had structure, recognition, and momentum. What it needed now was endurance. And endurance, in the medieval world, demanded constant effort. Hugues spent the final years of his life reinforcing what he had built. He returned once more to the Holy Land, not as a hopeful experimenter, but as the acknowledged leader of an international order. The Templars now guarded roads, manned strongholds, and advised rulers in matters of defense. Pilgrims traveled with greater confidence, knowing they were under the protection of men bound by vows rather than personal gain. Yet leadership had changed him. Gone was the younger knight shaped only by local customs and feudal loyalties. In his place stood a man who had learned to think across borders and generations. Every decision now carried consequences far beyond Jerusalem. A misstep in France could weaken support in the East. A failure of discipline in one house could tarnish the reputation of all. Hugues understood that institutions outlive individuals only if their foundations are strong. He devoted himself to reinforcing the rule of the order. Daily prayer remained central. Simplicity was enforced even as resources grew. Personal pride was discouraged. The Red Cross was not a symbol of triumph, but of obligation. This was not easy. Men drawn to the order often arrived with their own ideas of honor and glory. Hugues and his senior brothers had to reshape those instincts. The Templar ideal demanded obedience, restraint, and humility. Qualities that did not come naturally to many raised in the martial culture of the age. Still, the order held together. Contemporary records tell us little about Hugues's inner thoughts. But his actions suggest a man aware of history, watching him closely. He did not seek titles beyond his role. He did not surround himself with luxury. He traveled constantly, inspecting houses, resolving disputes, ensuring the order remained united in purpose. This constant movement took its toll. By the early 1130s, Hugues was no longer a young man. Years of campaigning, travel, and leadership had aged him. Others increasingly shouldered daily responsibilities. New commanders emerged, trained under the system he had designed. This transition was deliberate. Hugues was preparing the order to function without him. Sometime around 1136, Hugues de Payens died. The exact circumstances remain unclear. No dramatic final battle. No grand ceremony recorded in detail. His passing was quiet, fitting for a man who had never sought the spotlight. Yet the world he left behind was anything but quiet. The Knights Templar continued to grow rapidly after his death. Their discipline, reputation, and organization made them indispensable to rulers and pilgrims alike. What began as a solution to a local problem had become one of the most influential institutions of medieval Europe. That fact alone speaks to Hugues' success. But legacy is a complicated thing. Hugues de Payens did not live to see the suspicions that would later surround the order. He did not witness the rumors, the political tensions, or the catastrophic events that would one day bring the Templars to an end. Those chapters belong to a future shaped by forces far beyond his lifetime. What he did live to see was the transformation of an idea into reality. A new model of knighthood had taken root, one that fused spiritual discipline with martial duty, one that answered to a higher authority than kings, one that challenged the medieval world to reconsider what power, loyalty, and sacrifice truly meant. It is tempting to judge historical figures by what followed them, but doing so risks misunderstanding their intentions. Hugues did not set out to create an empire. He set out to solve a problem. Pilgrims were being attacked. Faithful people were afraid to travel. The roads were dangerous, and the world was unstable. His response was practical, rooted in the values of his time, and shaped by his own background as a modest noble familiar with hardship and duty. In that sense, Hugues was not a revolutionary in the modern sense. He did not seek to overturn society. He worked within its structures, carefully reshaping them from the inside. That may be why his influence lasted. The rule he helped establish endured for generations. The culture of discipline he enforced became the backbone of the order. Even critics of the Templars later acknowledged their effectiveness, their organization, and their commitment. When later centuries looked back, they often projected mystery and conspiracy onto the figure of the founder. Secrets were imagined. Hidden knowledge was invented. But the real Hugues de Payens appears far more grounded. He was a product of his world, responding intelligently to its dangers and opportunities. That does not make him small, it makes him remarkable. Few individuals manage to leave a mark that reshapes institutions rather than moments. Hugues' greatest achievement was not a battle won or a city defended. It was creating a framework that allowed others to act with shared purpose long after he was gone. The mantle he took up in Jerusalem was heavier than any cloak. It carried responsibility for lives, faith, and reputation. He bore it quietly, deliberately, and with lasting effect. When the Templar vows were first spoken, no one could have known how far their echoes would travel. Not across oceans or centuries, but across minds and structures. They altered how authority could be organized, how discipline could be enforced without tyranny, how belief could be translated into action. That is the true legacy of Hugues de Payens. Not mystery, but method. Not legend, but leadership. And in a world that often remembers noise more than substance, his quiet resolve may be the most powerful story of all.